So your Spring Boot app needs to save data for recall later on. Naturally, you'll want to connect to a database. But how do you do this with Spring Boot and Java? There's a few ways. One is using Spring JDBC, a lower level mechanism for connecting to and interacting with a database using SQL. Another is using Spring Data JPA, a higher level mechanism for connecting to and interacting with a database using Java objects. The SQL is generated for you. Today, we're going to cover Spring JDBC. So in this one, we're going to load some real data into a Postgres database. We're then going to query that database using Spring JDBC, and we're going to display the results via a REST API call. So let's get into it. I'm going to talk you through this project very, very quickly. So I've done a little bit of pre-work in here just to get us moving. Now, if we take a look here, we've got a straightforward REST controller. Now let's just zoom in. This REST controller is very, very basic. The only thing that it really has is a get endpoint /books. This endpoint is just there to list out a whole bunch of books. So I've got a list of 100 books and their authors, and we're going to load those into the database and we're going to see those printed out. So that's the controller part of things. Now you can see the controller is calling a book service here. So let's just take a look at the book service interface because we haven't yet implemented that one. And the book service is very, very straightforward. We're just going to get a list of books via a call of get books. Now, if we take a look at what a book constitutes, it shouldn't be very surprising. We've got an ISBN here, which is a string, which is the unique identifier for that book. We have the title of that book, and then we have the author of that book. Now, if you've seen the REST API tutorial, we had an author modeled as a string. In this case, we have it modeled as its own entity, an author. And the reason for that is so I can demonstrate for you how we can deal with multiple different entities using Spring JDBC. And it makes perfect sense as well for that to be modeled as its own entity. So let's just take a quick look at author. And we can see here we've got an ID, which is a long. We've got a name of the author, and then we've put the author's age in there as well, although we're not really going to be using the age too much in this. It's just there as information. So that's the controller, the service, and the domain objects. I'm just going to show you which dependencies we have in here. And this is a project that I downloaded from the Spring Initializer. And if we take a look here, we've just got the Spring Starter JDBC. So that is the JDBC API if you're selecting from the Spring Initializer. We have Spring Starter Web. So we've got the web, the Spring MVC stuff in here as well to allow us to do a REST API. We've got Lombok, good old Lombok, just to help us along and reduce some boilerplate code for us. And then I've included the Postgres driver as well. And this will allow us to connect directly to our Postgres database. And the Spring Boot starter test, although we're going to omit testing this time around just to show you the basics of this. Obviously, if it's production code, you should definitely be unit testing. But that is the long and short of this project. So let's get started with getting a Postgres database up and running and getting some data in that database, shall we? Now, if we take a look down here, we have a Docker Compose file. And in this Docker Compose file, if we zoom in, we've got two containers running in here. We've got the first one, which is just Postgres. And this is going to run on its standard port. We're going to map the port so we can access it from our local host. And we're specifying a password of example, which was actually what it was on the Postgres Docker website. So we'll keep it as that. Obviously, if you're in production, don't do that. And then we have adminer or adminer. I'm not really sure. But this is an application which runs a web application which allows us to see visually what's happening in the database. We're also going to be using this to load in the test data. And I'll leave a link to the file so you can download the test data below. So that'll be in the description below. But for the minute, all we really need to know is adminer is running, and it'll be running on port 8888. So I've changed it from port 8080 to port 8888 because, of course, our application is going to be running on 8080 by default. We can go ahead and start this in the following way. You need to have Docker installed, of course, and you need to be in the same directory as the Docker Compose file. But if we go down to the terminal here, we can simply run Docker Compose up. So just like that, we can hit Postgres as started, and we should be able to hit adminer in the browser as well. So let's go ahead and flip to the browser. And there we go. So adminer is there. We can actually now connect to our database. So we'll select Postgres. The server is DB. Now that references this here. So we can see DB. And the username is Postgres. And the password we set to example. So we should be able to log in now. And there we go. We have a nice blank database. So the next thing that we want to do is load in this data, and we can do that using the import command. And you can see here that it simply just wants a SQL file. So I'm going to, actually, before I load this in, let me show you this file. Let me open it up in Visual Code Studio. Here we are. So this is the import file that we're going to be running here. Now, I do need to stress, I'm expecting this to be run on a test database inside of Docker, something that you can just throw away. Please don't run this on any production databases. That would be bad. So we can see here that it first drops a table authors if it exists, and then it goes ahead and looks to populate authors. We can see here we've got Abigail Rose. So these are just randomly generated. I actually used ChatGPT to generate these. It was really handy, actually. And it inserts these authors. We can see there, so the name and then the age and then the ID. And then it goes on and it looks to create the table books, and it inserts some books for us. Again, these were completely randomly generated. Thank you, ChatGPT. And we can see also this last one here, we've got author ID. So this is the ID which references the author. Okay, so the authors we've already created. So we can see here this one, Rachel Wilson, has an ID of 100. So if we were to scroll down here, we can see that the Cryptic Castle references author ID 100. So she essentially wrote the book, The Cryptic Castle, in this test data. And that is the SQL file. So let's go ahead and load this in. So flipping back to the browser, we can choose a file. Okay, and I'm going to select that, import.sql. Okay, and then we will execute. And it looks like it's executed okay. We can test that out by... There we go. So we can see here we've got two tables. We've got one called authors and one called books. Let's take a look in the authors. Give that a click. And I'm pretty sure there was a select data. That should do. Okay, and we can see here we've got some names, we've got some ages, we've got some IDs, we've got some authors. Lovely stuff. Now, let's go back and take a look at the books. Do the same thing, select data. And we've got some books as well. The Forgotten Key, The Lost Heirloom, The Chosen One. ChatGPT is pretty cool. Pretty cool. Okay, so we've got some books. Now, let's see what we can do about getting these books displayed in a REST API. How we can do that by using Spring JDBC. So let's go back to our code. Okay, so the approach we're going to take with Spring JDBC is something called a DAO, or a Data Access Object. Now, it needs to be stressed, this is completely different from using something like Hibernate, which would be Spring JPA. We're using Spring JDBC. Now, you can think about it that Spring JDBC operates at a lower level than Spring JPA. And as a result, you need to actually write the SQL yourself. But it's worth having a grounding knowledge in this before you explore something like Spring JPA so you can really understand what's happening behind the curtain. So we're going to do a DAO, a Data Access Object, for the book to begin with. And we can do that very, very simply. If you found this useful so far and you want to see more content just like this, then be sure to subscribe. Now, we'll just go down here. In fact, we'll minimize the service. So we do need to create a service, but we will do that after creating our DAO, I think. So I'm going to create a new directory inside of here, and I'm going to go new folder. And I'm going to call this one simply DAOs. And I'm going to create a new file in here, and I'm going to call this one book DAO.java. And we want to do an interface. Now, a DAO operates very, very close to how things are modeled in the database. So we've seen that we have a table for books. We also have a table for authors. And we typically have things like create, read, update, and delete methods available on the DAO, which then allows us to essentially call those methods in order to interact directly with the database for the entity that's being modeled. Now, we're doing this for books. So we're not going to create a full DAO for this because actually I can demonstrate a DAO to you just by doing the read operations. So we're going to create a single method in here, and we're going to call it, it's going to return a list of books to begin with. And we're going to call this one, let's call it list books. Do some imports. So it's going to have a simple method on here called list books. You could also have a method on here to create a book, delete a book, update a book, all that good stuff. But actually, I think I can get the gist across by just calling list books here. So we're going to need to implement this. So let's create a directory and call it impl. Again, a bit of a convention. Not a big fan of it, but it seems to work. So book DAO impl.java. The reason for this is that you always want to code to interfaces, never to the concrete implementations. And that just allows you to have that extra flexibility. And it's one of those learnings from the clean code approach. So we need to implement the interface, Book DAO. And Visual Code Studio should be nice enough that it's going to add some unimplemented methods for me. Thank you ever so much. And we can see here we have list books. So the next question becomes, how do we connect to the database and how do we query it such that we can return a list of books? And we can do that in various different ways. But the first thing that we need to handle is we actually just need to connect to the database. And the way that we do that in Spring, at least, is via something called the data source. Now, the data source is an object which basically models that connection to the database. And then we can use it in various different ways later on. But we do need that data source. And there's two ways of creating it. In Spring Boot, you can create it directly just by putting some configuration inside of the application.yaml or the application.properties. In this instance, I've changed it to .yaml because it's going to be a little bit easier for me to demonstrate that configuration later. But I'm going to show you how to do it programmatically first so you can appreciate how easy the configurations approach makes it. So we're going to go into a config up here, create a new file, and in this file, or this file will be called, let's call it database config. That looks good. .java. And I need to give it the annotation of @configuration. Let's import that. And that tells Spring, hey, there's going to be some configuration here. Look for beans. And we need to create a bean now to represent this data source. So let's fill that in. And there we go. So there is our data source bean. So let me just talk you through this. We've got a data source builder, which allows us to create this data source in a nice way. And we've specified first the driver class name. So this specifies that we're connecting to a Postgres database. And this is the driver that we're going to use for that. We then specify the URL. Now, this particular URL is a PostgreSQL specific one. We can see here JDBC, using JDBC, PostgreSQL, and we're connecting to localhost on port 5432, which is the Postgres database port that it's a default port, but it's also the one that we're using. And we're connecting to the Postgres database there. And then we specify the username and password. We've done this in plain text. So we can see here we've got Postgres and then example, exactly the same configuration that we use to log in on adminer. You do not want to commit this. You do not want to have your credentials inside of your source code or even in source control at all. It's not very secure, which is one of the downsides to this approach. But for this tutorial, it's absolutely fine to do that. And there we go. We've got a data source, and then this data source object, as it's a bean, will be available to dependency inject. So whenever we use @autowired and we say, hey, we need a data source, Spring is going to say, hey, here's one. It's a bean in the configuration, and you can use it as you like. So that is one way to do it. But that is not the way that we're going to do things today. We are going to do it the easy way, which is via the configuration. So if we flip back over to, we flip over to resources application YAML. So I'm going to fill in this configuration and you should see some parallels between the two. There we go. So we can see here, Spring data source, we've got a driver class name, exactly the same as we had in our programmatic configuration, a URL, the username and the password. And the brilliant thing about this as well is Spring Boot has this really cool thing where if we were to omit these, for example, we could actually provide environment variables. As an example, there's actually a series of places that Spring Boot looks for its configuration, this config file being one of them, environment variables being another. And by convention, if we were to provide an environment variable matching username or password, it would load it in. But we're going to do it in this way because let's just rely on Spring Boot to create the data source object for us. So we're just going to leave that commented out for the time being. So we now have a data source. What do we do with that? How do we use the data source? Well, the way that we would do this in Spring JDBC, or one of the ways, is by using the Spring JDBC template. And the way that we do that is we go back over to our configuration. So we'll create a bean for it. Let me fill that in. And there it is. So you can see here, we require a data source. This is commented out, but it's okay because Spring Boot is going to create the data source from the configuration we've put in our application.properties or application.yaml. And it's going to inject that data source. And then we're going to simply pass in the data source to a new JDBC template constructor. And then because it's a bean, anytime that we ask for a JDBC template, Spring will inject one for us. So we now have a JDBC template, which is all well and good. How do we use it? Let's give it a go. So we need to flip back to the DAO class, and we'll just do that now quickly. There we go. We need to get a handle on that JDBC template. So I'm going to go private, final, JDBC template, calling it JDBC template. And see if it can, there we go, generate a constructor for me. Lovely stuff. So we've made this final because it's good practice to do so it can't be reassigned once it's initialized. And we're setting it via the constructor here. We can see here that constructor requires a JDBC template to be passed in. And then we're assigning it to this local instance variable. Now, a lot of you pointed out to me, actually, that we don't need an auto-wired on here. So in days gone by, we would need to put an auto-wired annotation above this constructor. However, a lot of smart people out there pointing out that we don't actually need that anymore because we have a single constructor. Then Spring just knows to treat that in the same way as if it had an auto-wired annotation. So to save us a little bit of typing, we'll just leave that off, I think. Now, that JDBC template is now available via the local instance variable. So how do we use it? Just like so. So we'll use JDBC template. And we want to query it for a list of books. So we can simply say query. Let's write our SQL. So we're going to select, and then we're going to say the names of the columns that we want to return, which in this case is ISBN, and also the title of the book. We want to select ISBN and title from the table books, and there we go. So we want the ISBN and the title to be returned from the table books. And now we should be able to do our row mapper. So let's see if we can pre-populate this for us. There we go, very good. Although it hasn't done the types, so I'm just going to do those. Not strictly needed, but they do help to demonstrate the point. So we have a result set, RS, and then we also have a row number, which is an integer. And now we're going to implement this. This is a functional interface. So we simply need to take a result set and a row number and turn that into a book object. And the way that we can do that is by using the builder pattern. So we'll do book.builder, and then we're going to call ISBN. And now we need to provide the value of the ISBN. So we can do that by calling the result set and then getting a string. And the name of the string is the column name, which in this case is ISBN. And we're also going to do that for the title, passing in title, which is the column name for title. And then we're going to call .build. Okay, so we'll return that from our implementation of the interface. And we also need to return the result of calling .query on the JDBC template. And just like that, we have an implementation for list books. So first we have the SQL, which we just used to interact with the database here. So select ISBN title from books, gives us all of the books, returning just the ISBN and title columns from them. And then we've done a row mapper, which converts that result. So each row will then be turned into a book. And we're going to extract the ISBN and the title, put them into this book object, and then we'll return a list of books. And that is our implementation in the DAO pattern. So let's wire this up to our REST controller and see the results in Postman, shall we? So we'll go over, I think, now to implementing our service. So we have book service. We need a new folder, and we'll call this one impl, new file, and we'll call this one book service impl.java. This is a class, and it implements the book service, and then we should be able to auto-generate our unimplemented methods, and there it is, get books, which you'll notice the return type is a list of books, meaning we should be able to get hold of our book DAO, which we can do like so, book DAO, put a final in there, and then we can generate our constructor. And again, we can omit that at auto-wired, but we do need to tell Spring that this is a service. So it's a candidate for auto-wiring, but also that it should look to auto-wire if there is no auto-wired annotation or there is a single constructor like this. So we now have our book DAO, meaning the implementation for our service is fairly straightforward. Book DAO, and it was list books, return. There we go. So with that being the case, then we should be able to start our application. So we'll do that on a separate terminal window, and we'll run the Maven wrapper, which is this one here. Because I don't have Maven installed on my core system. If you have Maven installed on your core system, you could just use that. So Maven, and then we'll do spring-boot run. And providing, okay, build failure. Why is that? Okay, everything's compiling. So not sure. Ah, here we go. Consider defining a bean of type book DAO in your configuration. Aha, we've missed an annotation. So if we go to the book DAO implementation, yep, there we go. So I'm going to put this into the Spring context by putting @component on here. It's not strictly a service. It's not strictly a repository. It's a component. So I'm going to use a component annotation. Component, repository, and @service all tend to do the same thing, but we're going to do @component there. So let's go back down to our terminal and run Spring Boot run once more. Okay, it looks like, yep, application has started. Everything looks good. Very interesting. Let's go over to Postman and hit that listbooks endpoint. So here it is, git, and then /books on port 8080, which is where our application is running. Let's click on send. We're expecting to see a list of books. So it's going to connect to the database, and if our Spring JDBC implementation has worked, we should see those books. Let's click send. Okay, looking good. We have a status HTTP 200. Okay, great. And we have a list of books here. We have the ISBN, and then we have the title called title. That's not what we're expecting to see. Why is that? Let's go back over to our implementation, and that would be why, wouldn't it? So we're going to do rs.getString, and in this case, passing in title to that call. Spring Boot run, and we're up and running. Perfect. So let's click on send once more. That's a little bit better. So we can see here the ISBN and the title, The Shadow in the Attic, Beyond the Horizon, The Last Ember, all great names for books, all coming straight from ChatGPT. But we do see that our author is null. And that's because we've done a Book DAO, not an Author DAO. So we need to do an Author DAO. And then I'll teach you how to combine the two in order to get this. Essentially, it's a book, but it has a nested author. So it's populating two entities. So let's first do the Author DAO, shall we? So we'll go back over to our code. And we've already seen this once, so this should be a fairly familiar pattern. So we're going to create a new file. And I'm going to call this one author DAO.java. And this is an interface. There's a few ways of doing this, but the way that we'll do this today is I'm going to do a single method. We pass it the ISBN for a book, remembering that's the unique identifier, and it's going to give us back the author for that book. I'm going to have the method signature have a return value of an optional author. So an optional, remember, is always returned, but it has two states. It's a monad. It can either be present or it can either be empty. So in the case that the ISBN is provided and an author is found, then it will be an optional with a value of that author. However, if we give it an ISBN and it doesn't find an author, it will return an optional with the status of empty because there won't be an author there. Let us create an optional author, and we'll call this one get author by book ISBN. And then we'll pass in a string with the field, with the name ISBN. Let's do some imports. So here we have get author by book ISBN. We pass in the ISBN as a string, and then we have an optional author. So in the case that the author is found, is an optional with a value of author. And in the case that the author is not found, it will be an optional with a value of empty. So let's do the implementation for this, which we can do by creating a new class in here called, not book, but author. Author DAO impl.java. There we go. And this is a class. And this one implements author DAO. And then Visual Code Studio will be kind enough to add the unimplemented method for me. And here we go. So we do need a reference to that JDBC template, just like before. So JDBC template, we'll call that JDBC template. It's private. And then we will generate our constructor. There we go. Don't need that auto-wired, so that's perfect. That will be populated. Now we can use it in this method implementation. So let me fill in this implementation, and then I'll talk you through it because it's ever so slightly different from what we saw before on the Book DAO. So here we go. This is the implementation for get author by book ISBN. So we can see here we are using the method query for row set. This is because we require something ever so slightly different from this method. We want to know, first of all, if there is any results. So we will need to do that if results exist and if not. But also we need to be passing in parameters, whereas we didn't before. We're wanting to get the specific author for a book as identified by the ISBN. So we need to pass in the ISBN to our query. And we're doing it using this manner, which is the safest. It's using a prepared statement, rather than concatenating it directly into the string. We want to avoid that if at all possible, because when we're not using prepared statements, it's impossible to open ourselves up to things like SQL injection attacks. So always use the prepared statement approach where you can. So let me talk you through what's happening here. We pass in a SQL like before, but this SQL is a little bit more elaborate than before. So let me talk you through it. First things first, we've got this dot notation here, a dot. Why is that? Well, we are dealing with two tables here. We're dealing with authors, which I've given the alias of A, and we're also dealing with the books table, which I've given the alias of B. So we're seeing a dot, which means from the table authors, return the ID, And then we're saying return it as the alias of ID, just to keep things simple down here. We're doing the same for name. So return the author's name and call it name. Return the author's age and call it age. And now we're doing a join. So we're basically saying, look at the table of authors and look at the table of books. And I want you to join the two where the author ID matches the ID of the author in the authors table. So essentially you can think of it plucking the author as identified by the author ID in the books table and then gluing that on to the end of the results that's returned for a particular book. And we can see here we're specifying only return results where it matches a particular ISBN. As specified, it's a question mark in the string, but you can see here we're passing in the ISBN as it's passed into the method up here as an additional parameter. So essentially, this will swap out the question mark for the ISBN, but it will do it in a nice, safe way. And we can see here, we've done this if statement. So we're saying if result.next. So what we're saying, return the author, populating the author information that we can see here. So get the long, which is the ID, get the string, which is the name, and then get the integer, which is the age. Create an author object, wrap it in optional, and in the case that we do actually have information that we can populate, return the author. However, if we don't find information, if the result set is empty, then we're just going to return that optional.empty. So this is our implementation of get author by book ISBN. But how are we going to use this, right? Because we want to return a list of books, and in that list of books, I want the author information nested inside of it. So whereas before, in fact, let's go over to Postman. So whereas before the author is null, I essentially want to see all of the author information nested as another JSON object inside of here. So how do I do that? Well, it doesn't necessarily make sense to do that inside of the Book DAO because the pattern determines that only the book-related stuff goes inside of the Book DAO, where the author-related stuff goes inside of the Author DAO. But there is a pattern which combines multiple DAOs, and that's the repository, which you may have already seen in previous tutorials when we're dealing with Spring JDBC, and it's kind of a natural progression. So let's do a repository implementation. So let's flip back to our code, and I'm going to create a new directory in here, pull that out, and then do new folder, because otherwise I tend to create them in the wrong places. And we're going to call this one repositories, and I'm going to create a new file in here, and I'm going to call it book repository.java. And this is going to be an interface, and book repository.java is going to return a list of books. And we're just simply going to say, let's call it list book, shall we? And we'll need to do some imports. There we go. So straightforward, book repository, list books. In fact, it's pretty much identical to the signature that's on our Book DAO, but the implementation is going to be slightly different. It's going to have slightly different context. So let's create an impl directory, and we'll create a new file in here. So we're going to call this one, let's call it book repository impl.java. There we go. And then we'll do implements, the book repository. And while I remember, let's put that at repository annotation on the top there and have Visual Code Studio add the unimplemented methods. Thank you ever so much. So now we want to do our implementation for list books. And I said this repository is going to combine the use of those two DAOs. So we need access to both of them. So let's get some references. Private final, book DAO, private final. And we want author DAO. And then we're going to have, there we are, let's generate the constructor to expect both of them. Lovely stuff. And we don't need that at auto-wired, but well, it's going to make a huge amount of difference, but let's just put some finals on there. Okay, why on earth let's put that down there? There we go. It was still quicker. So we have the Book DAO and then the Author DAO. So we need to be able to use both of those inside of list books. Now, it's worth mentioning this is not by any stretch of the imagination the most optimized way of doing things. In fact, it demonstrates a limitation of this approach, but bear with. So we're going to first of all do Book DAO, and we're going to call on the Book DAO list books. Remembering this returns us a list of books, but it doesn't have any author information. So we're now going to, let's do a stream on this and then do .map and then get the reference to that book inside of .map. So the map is essentially going to take in a book and then we can do something to it and then we're going to return a book, but we could return a different type. We're going to say inside of this author DAO dot get author by book ISBN, and then we're going to say book dot get ISBN. And this is going to return an optional. In the case that the author doesn't exist, I want it just to default to null like before, I think. We can, at this point, choose to do something different, but I think that's a reasonable thing to do for the moment. Let's create a variable and call it author. This, of course, is returning an optional for the moment, so we're going to say, or else, just return null, I think. There we go, or else null. I imported author. I haven't. So we now have, or we should have, the author for that book or null. So what we're going to do, we're going to do book dot set author, and then we're going to return the author. And then let's do a return statement up here. Oh, of course, we haven't, it's still a stream at this point. So we need to call doc, that work? Dot collect, collectors to list. I think to list might have been a shortcut, you know, but cannot convert from list of author to list book. Well, returning the wrong thing, that would be why. So we need to return book instead of author. There we go. All the squiggles go away. Wonderful stuff. So let's just go through this and then our drawbacks, I suppose. So essentially getting the author for the book here. So for each of the books, get the author for that book, and there's a reference to it there. If we can't find it, it will be null. And then we're setting the author on the book, and then we're returning the book. So this is essentially going to do a database call per book. We can certainly optimize on that. And that's one of the benefits of using Spring JPA, because Spring JPA does a lot of this stuff for you. But the DAO pattern, it kind of deals with things like this is a book, this is an author. And when they go to combine them, it's usually done programmatically inside of the Java code rather than the database. Now, that's not strictly true because everybody has a different approach to this. But, you know, in the most basic example that we're giving here, it's certainly the case. It's not the most optimized, but we'll see JPA in future tutorials. So yeah, just bear that in mind for this implementation, but it should work. So we now have our list of books, and this list of books has author information on it. Let's prove that, shall we? So let's go back over to our service, book service import, but rather than dealing with the Book DAO, which operates at a much lower level than our book repository, let's get hold of our book repository. Okay, so we have now a handle for our book repository. So we're going to call book repository.listbooks, and it should return our list of books. Well, the difference being our repository deals with both DAOs, both the book one and the author one, combining the information for exactly what we're looking to see. So let's go down here, restart our application, and fingers crossed, we should see some author information alongside our book information. We are missing an annotation on Author DAO. There we go, add component. Lovely stuff. Let's try once more. Okay, we have an application up and running. So let's go back to Postman. Okay, so everything is null because this is from the previous request. Let's click send. Well, it's HTTP 200, so that's a good start. And if we look over here, we have the ISBN and title as before, but we also have the author information populated, including the ID, the name of the author, and their age. And we can see it's done it for every single author here. It has also made an additional request for every single author, but nevertheless, the information is returned. So let me just tee you up for the transition to Spring JPA. So in Spring JPA, we tend not to use the DAO pattern. We tend to operate at the much higher level of the repository. And what's more is that if we were to go to our repository interface here, when we're dealing with the JDBC level, we had to provide an implementation for this interface. So book repository, list books, that's all well and good. But here's the implementation for it that we had to code ourselves. In Spring JPA, so that's one that uses Hibernate, and this is magic. Spring generates the implementation for us. And of course, it generates optimized SQL, usually. And it means that we tend to reduce the number of requests that are sent to the database. It also handles other things for us, things like caching and also transactions. But again, it's kind of out the scope of this discussion, and we can deal with it when we get into JPA. So in a nutshell then, this is how to do Spring JDBC using the DAO pattern, and teed you up for dealing with Spring JPA, which should be next time around. And as before, I'll push this to GitHub, and I'll leave a link below, and I'll also leave a link below to that test data. And there we go, a basic introduction on how to use Spring JDBC. Now, if you're interested in the other things that Spring can do, then be sure to check out this tutorial where we build an application which integrates with Apache Kafka. I'll see you over there.